All righty, how's everyone doing today? How's your DrupalCon so far? I'm expecting to hear a lot of cheering, a lot of shouting, a lot of people screaming and cheering right now. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce this next session here at DrupalCon North America 2021. My name is Preston So. I'm the Senior Director of Product Strategy at Oracle for Oracle Content Management. I'm also Editor-in-Chief of Tag One Consulting and also editor at A List Apart magazine. I'm also the author of Decoupled Drupal in Practice, the Bible for Decoupled Drupal, as well as the author of two upcoming books coming out later this year. Number one, Voice Content and Usability, which will be published by A Book Apart in July, and Gatsby, the Definitive Guide about Gatsby.js, which will be published by O'Reilly in November. By the way, I'm also the founder of Decoupled Days, the only nonprofit conference for that covers the topic of headless CMS in the world. And our call for papers is open until May 1st. And we also have early bird tickets still available at decoupleddays.com. Well, it's my pleasure today to introduce this fireside chat here at DrupalCon North America, Creating Systemic Change, Digital Rights for All. Just a quick housekeeping note for everyone who's following along here at home or wherever you may be. I just want to remind you all that there's a link to real-time cart captioning available pinned in chat. So if you'd like to follow along with captions, please feel free to follow that link. And it's my pleasure today to introduce our guests and our esteemed speaker here joining me on this fireside chat, Nani Janssen-Reventlow. Nani Janssen-Reventlow is the founding director of the Digital Freedom Fund, which supports partners in Europe to advance digital rights through strategic litigation. She is a recognized, that's a hard phrase to say, I gotta say. It's terrible, it's terrible. She is a recognized international lawyer and expert in human rights litigation responsible for standard-setting freedom of expression cases across several national and international jurisdictions. Nani is a lecturer in law at Columbia Law School right here in New York City, an adjunct professor at Oxford University's Blavatnik School of Government. How are you doing today, Nani? Good to see you.
Good to see you too. And I often wonder why I decided to focus on something that's such a tongue twister. Strategic litigation is not easy. That's for sure.
It's a hard word to say. It's a hard phrase to say. And we're going to get right into it. So let's go ahead and jump right into the first topic, which I think is something that's really important and near and dear to a lot of folks here at DrupalCon North America. One of the enduring myths of open source, and a lot of folks here at DrupalCon can speak to this, one of the most enduring myths of open source is that it's a meritocratic space where anyone can do anything, everyone can do anything that they have the potential to do, as long as they set their minds to it. But we see from systemic barriers and systemic oppression that that myth simply isn't true. So I wanted to ask, first and foremost, in what ways can we see this truth, that the idea of meritocracy is actually a myth?
Thank you, and that's an excellent question. Just to preface this, like I'm speaking from my experience in working on digital rights in Europe, so I'm not necessarily an expert on open source or anything. But the way that I see manifested that meritocracy is a myth is whenever I step into a room here in Europe where digital rights are being discussed, that the composition of those rooms is overall white, able-bodied, heterosexual, mostly male. So nothing what our society looks like. And the fact that these rooms, that the composition of these rooms look that way, in spite of that, I see as evidence that there are really structural barriers that are preventing this from being a much more inclusive debate.
And I think one of the things you mentioned is really interesting, this idea that, in open source, in software, also in law as well, there's this tendency to focus on meritocracy, this notion that, as long as you've got the ability, you can kind of do anything you want to. But as you mentioned, one of the things that's happened in history is that the voices of, white, cishet, able-bodied males has generally held more sway and more, let's say, power over those who are marginalized or those who have been silenced over the course of history. So I wanted to ask, from your standpoint, in terms of your body of work, as well as historically speaking, how have these unequal power structures manifested in your view?
Power is the key word here, right? So the power structures that we see manifested in our societies at the moment have their history, have their roots in a history of domination and of colonization. And that history has shaped very much what our societies look like nowadays, how we organize it, who we actually give power to, who we try to keep it away from. These power structures thrive in a way on maintaining systems of oppression for those who we do not want to give power to. So, and by power structures and by systems of oppression, I'm thinking of racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, etc., etc. And these existed before we entered the so-called digital age. We had those offline as much as we have them now in a digital context. But in a way, we're making things worse right now. We're not only replicating those power structures that we've seen offline, but we're actually amplifying them through the technology that we are constructing and developing in these contexts, which have such distorted power structures.
Absolutely. And I want to get into those distorted power structures in just a little bit, because I think there's a lot of interesting material to cover there. But first, I want to just tease out a little bit of something you just said just now, which is, this notion of colonization. And, here in the United States and in North America in general, there's a lot of talk, especially in English-speaking countries, about this notion of diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's a lot of folks here at DrupalCon who are working on this. The Drupal Diversity and Inclusion Group is one example of a really great and powerful and sort of under-recognized force, I would say, in helping to make the Drupal community and also open source software in general a more equitable place for all. But even though we hear a lot about this kind of phrase that's bandied about quite a bit by a lot of folks, diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI. Sometimes I feel that in the US especially, we don't hear as much about this concept of decolonization. And so I know this is something you've spoken about quite a bit. We spoke about this before as well. What exactly is decolonization? What does this notion of decoloniality look like? And in particular, especially for our audience here joining us, what exactly are the differences between decolonization, this idea of decolonization, and what we understand currently as diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Great question. First, to kind of stress that I'm not an expert on decoloniality. I'm not a scholar on decolonizing or anything. So I can speak to this from the perspective of the work that we're trying to do with the Digital Freedom Fund, which is together with EDRI, European Digital Rights, set in motion a process to decolonize the digital rights field. And we refer to it as a process rather than as a noun. So we're talking about decolonizing because it's a process that, in essence will never be over, right? It will never be finished. The reason that we went with that framing instead of diversity and inclusion or diversity, equity, and inclusion is that we want to do justice to the fact that we're really trying to get at root causes. So we were just talking about systems of oppression. We're really trying to figure out what are the power structures in the digital rights field that we are seeing right now, and how do they need to change in order to bring about this stepping into a room and seeing a completely different picture than we're seeing at the moment. And I think that I'm not kind of challenging the underlying motives for diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, but I do think that it's important to reflect on what we exactly mean by that and where that is going to get us. If you're talking about diversity, who are you taking implicitly as being the norm? When you talk about equity, are you accounting for historical and structural inequalities, or is it a more limited framing? And if you talk about inclusion, what are you proposing to include whom into, right? If you're not really changing the flaws within the ecosystem that you're working in, it's not going to be a very attractive place to be included in, because it's probably going to be a place, for one, where you're going to have to do an awful lot of work to actually try and change that system in a more fundamental way. So it's really about focusing on changing that ecosystem itself, rather than kind of bringing in whoever you think you should be bringing into it.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the things that I've seen certainly is that people use this phrase diversity, equity, and inclusion to paper over, in a sense, potentially some of these ecosystem level changes, these system level changes that we really want to see. So you mentioned the Digital Freedom Fund, and I want to dig into that a little bit. But first, one thing that I think is really interesting about your body of work is that you've been involved in some amazing litigation around the world with regard to human rights, fighting for the rights of so many different people of so many different backgrounds on behalf of them for their freedom of expression and their ability to do their work professionally, when it comes to journalism, when it comes to freedom of speech, all of these things that are core tenets of what we consider today to be part of human rights. But one of the things that I wanted to ask you, Nani, is, I think a lot of us here at DrupalCon have some sense of what the phrase digital rights means. But, just to contextualize this a little bit, in your view and your kind of work and in terms of your views on this, what's the relationship between human rights writ large and digital rights?
So digital rights are human rights. So there's a more traditional notion of digital rights as mainly relating to privacy, data protection, freedom of expression online. But we really take the approach that digital rights are all human rights as engaged in the digital context. And so it's not limited to just civil and political rights, but also economic, social, and cultural rights. And I think that has become a little bit more relatable over the past year due to, sadly, the pandemic, where all of a sudden, in trying to fight a global health crisis, technology has been pushed so much, right, as a solution. So the connection that you see there between technology and the right to health care, should you be trading off privacy rights in order to kind of perhaps benefit from the promise of the protection of a COVID tracing app, etc. Those questions have come much more to the fore, as has done things such as education, because people have to have been engaged in remote schooling, etc. So it's not just about freedom of expression, privacy, and all of those things, but also the economic, social, and cultural rights that we have.
Absolutely. And I think we see this, in the ongoing debates that are still raging about education access, about internet access, about, high quality broadband here in the United States. As well, there's a push right now to reopen schools in Brazil, while this kind of level of inequity in education and internet access is still a significant issue. Mm-hmm. So let's dig into the Digital Freedom Fund, because I think that when it comes to this phrase that I'm going to trip over again, strategic litigation, there's a really kind of important role that the Digital Freedom Fund plays. So I understand that the Digital Freedom Fund does a lot of work in terms of underwriting grants that specifically are focused on digital rights and this notion of really enabling and creating this systemic change. Could you tell us a little bit more about what the Digital Freedom Fund is? What does your team do, and how does that tie into all of these problems that we mentioned?
Yeah, so we indeed support strategic litigation on digital rights. We work in Europe, Council of Europe area at the moment. What we mean by strategic litigation is litigation that can bring about more systemic change. Those are cases that would have an impact that potentially would go way beyond the people, individuals, or entities that are involved in the case at hand. What we do is a number of different things. One is we provide financial support for such cases. So we run a number of calls per year, and people can come to us with litigation plans, that concern digital rights in Europe. Another thing that we do is bring together litigators, organizations that work on advocacy, on policy, etc., on digital rights in the region, to make sure that they have space to collaborate, to strategize, and kind of basically work together. And the idea of that is, again, to kind of make sure that the different organizations working together would have increased impact in their work. It's not our goal to make everybody a litigator. By all means, not everybody should rush to court. But it is important to make sure that strategic litigation is included as one of the potential tools for change. If you are really trying to pursue systemic change, it's good to look at the different ways of getting there, right? So there's public advocacy, there's campaigning, there's lobbying, and there's litigation. And ideally, you create a situation in which all of these work in tandem so that you can really have the impact that you're trying to pursue.
Wonderful. I think one of the interesting things here that, I know that we spoke last time about this a little bit, but I'm really curious about some of what you said. And there's a really kind of, good kind of saying, which is we should always practice what we preach. We should always work on making sure that the things that we're espousing, the approaches that we want people to adopt, are things that we're also adopting within our own organizations. And I wanted to ask you, how is the Digital Freedom Fund working on the inside of its own structures, systems, and processes to do exactly that, practice what you all preach as a team?
This is a really good question. So I was just mentioning like the focus of our work, which is this supporting strategic litigation. And one of the things that and bringing people together. And one of the things that we noticed from the very outset is like how siloed the digital rights field is at the moment. It's siloed in very many ways. It's kind of like siloed off from general human rights organizations, from trade unions, but also from organizations working on racial, social, and economic justice. So we're trying to kind of address that through the process that I was referring to before, the decolonizing process, but also through a Digital Rights for All project, which is working with racial, social, and economic justice organizations to develop strategies, litigation, policy, advocacy on digital rights, with a view of kind of making those fields kind of more work together in a much more holistic way. So that is one thing. So in the end, that also means that we should be able to kind of like support really wonderful strategic cases that address these issues, right? Social injustice, racial injustice, economic injustice in the digital context. So one of the questions we need to ask ourselves is like, our grant-making procedures, our grant-making criteria, are they actually fit for purpose actually to be able to deliver on that? What are perhaps the barriers that we are creating in the way that we work and in the way that grantees can come to us and how we can support them that makes that more difficult for certain groups or certain movements? So that is something that we kind of like need to look at in depth. Other really kind of like concrete things is like our governance. Like I have to say that like my board, like many boards out there, isn't exactly the picture of diversity at the moment. And the board knows that also, and they're working on it. They're also like, okay, yeah, we need to kind of like make sure that we address this. So they're also in the middle of a process right now of reflecting on their own composition. Our own procedures internally, do we have policies that make it actually a place to work for everyone or not? Are we being exclusive in that kind of way? How do we hire? How do we recruit? How do we make sure that everyone can thrive? So there's a lot of questions. It's a really long checklist. In the end, I think it's like a process of continuous reflection, right? And keep on holding ourselves to account and not shying away from the hard questions that we can't answer like on the spot, perhaps, but where we can kind of figure out a way to change them over time. So it's both about being super critical, I think, of yourself, and also cutting yourself sufficient slack in the sense that, like, change doesn't happen overnight. Also not if you have a lot of freedom in doing so. These are just generally the processes that take a little while.
Absolutely. And the biggest thing is, nobody should be a token. Nobody should be, just there to be that face of color on the page, or that face, who's queer on the page, or that's not something that is true representation or true diversity.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So one thing that you mentioned just now was racial justice and social justice. And one thing I do want to hold space for here at DrupalCon North America is that many of us here at the conference, many of us around the country are grieving for Daunte Wright, who was killed just earlier this weekend in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota. And one of the things that I think a lot of Americans especially are struggling with at the moment, in the context of obviously the coronavirus pandemic, obviously everything that is related to the notion of the Me Too movement, of Black Lives Matter, Black Trans Lives Matter, all of these issues that are really coming to the surface and have been very pressing issues for a long time, is that digital rights is very much wrapped up in human rights and in social justice. And you said something very interesting in our last conversation, Nani, that I just wanted to kind of tease out here, which was, you stated that, data freedom and this notion of having this notion of digital rights when it comes to your own data and this notion of digital equity is really about the concept of having a room of one's own. Could you share a little bit about what this means when it comes to digital rights, freedom of expression, and the free flow of information online, especially given that we're experiencing, a huge rise in protest movements, in backsliding in democracy, and a lot of these things that are pressing issues today here in North America?
Yeah, I was trying to reflect by that reference actually a little bit on the privilege aspect of that idea of a room and the money that Virginia Woolf said was it all what women needed to write. Besides the very obvious privilege aspect of that, like who gets to have a room, who gets to have money and sit down and write, it kind of discounts for the complexity of real life, right? And I think that the link that I was making is that there generally tends to be a lack of a proper holistic view of digital rights at the moment, and much more a narrow focus on these issues that I mentioned before, data protection, privacy, freedom of expression online, but very much with the interests and the preoccupations of the privileged few front and center. You touch upon a number of really interesting things there, like how does freedom of expression online relate to the right to protest, right? What can we actually do when the police is kind of like monitoring social media and surveilling us in order to make sure that they can clamp down on the legitimate right to protest? What does my right to freedom of expression online actually mean if we know that content moderation policies are completely skewed against me, right? I think that one of the things that we would hope to see, like also in kind of like changing the composition of the room when we're talking about digital rights, is also a change in priorities and a change in kind of like looking at these issues in a much more holistic way than we are doing right now.
Absolutely. And I think that's a very good summary of what it means to be in the room, what it means to have a seat at the table, which is something that really only a very small subset of a lot of folks can access, even still today. So let's talk about artificial intelligence. It's a big topic right now. There's been a lot of discussion, a lot of controversy surrounding big tech corporations like Google. And there's been a lot of concern about how these large corporations aren't meaningfully addressing algorithmic oppression, such as automated racism. And one of the things I mentioned in my book that's coming out in July with A Book Apart, Voice, Content, and Usability, is how the design of Apple Siri, Amazon Alexa, Microsoft Cortana actually weaponize artificial intelligence to worsen the biases our society has about women as being secretarial. And I wanted to ask, when it comes to the Digital Freedom Fund, what sorts of strategic cases, what sorts of issues, what sorts of preventative work is the Digital Freedom Fund doing when it comes to AI?
Well, we don't have a case that's as cool as that, like challenging why Alexa is a woman to begin with. I'd love that, actually. But at the moment, we are mostly seeing movement in the context of the provision of essential government services, and also governments actually using these types of systems, AI systems, in the way that they do their work. So one important case that we supported recently, that was one just a little over a year ago, was in the Netherlands, which was called the Siri case, but it's not Siri as in the Apple Siri, but it was called, it's a short for System Risk Indication Siri case, which was a case in which the government had connected together several government databases and ran an algorithm over it to detect who could potentially be committing benefits fraud. So not actually committed benefits fraud, but the likelihood of someone committing fraud was being flagged. So it was very much a Minority Report. For those of you who are old enough to have seen that movie, it's a long time ago, I know. It's literally pre-crime detection, right? And based on that flag, law enforcement could initiate further investigations into those individuals, of course, increasing enormously the likelihood that something would be found because, yeah, anyway, so that reinforces itself. That system was rolled out mainly in areas with high immigration and low income rates. And fortunately was taken to court by a coalition of human rights organizations, trade unions, etc., and was found to be in violation of the right to privacy. What is interesting about that case is, besides the fact that it's one of the first that kind of deals with these types of systems, is that actually the discriminatory aspect of it wasn't that much front and center in the case, right? And this kind of ties into what you said before, like how does it work, like as a grant maker, etc. Those are things in which I would want to make sure that we have better tools as a funder to make sure that those conversations are had more thoroughly and also sooner with litigants. Like, why isn't this actually one of the really fundamental prongs of your arguments? Very generally speaking, not an awful lot of litigation on AI issues yet, which is something that I think is still very much in development. We've been trying to work on making it more accessible for people, creating resources so technologists can understand the law, lawyers can understand the tech, and people can better figure out where to start. But it's very much in early days still when it comes to litigation anyway.
Most certainly, and I do remember reading in the Dutch newspapers about the benefit scandal and you know how that impacted so many people who are already oppressed and are already marginalized in Dutch society, and you know it's one of those things that really highlights the fact that we can't just think about these things as an afterthought. It has to be very much a central piece of the way that we combat, you know, for example, the automated racism that Mark Rutte's government allowed to happen, or some of the ways in which Black and Muslim folks in the Netherlands have really disproportionately been impacted by this, and still to this day are impacted by this. So I wanted to turn to a different topic here, which is once again about kind of the centralization of power and the concentration of power. You know, last year, Brazil joined the European Union in implementing legislation very similar to the GDPR. And actually, I've got a very dear friend of mine in São Paulo who is specializing in the Brazilian version of that law. And this is really important when it comes to protecting online users. And part of this is there's been a lot of deep concern about the centralization of power in just a few big tech corporations. This is a big concern in the European Union, in Australia. So I wanted to ask, you know, from a supranational and from a much larger perspective, how should the justice system overall change to stop this power centralization from getting worse? And are there things, for example, that open source ecosystems, open source governance structures can learn from these kinds of paradigms?
Yeah, that's a super multi-layered issue, right? How to deal with this. I think there's two big things. One is indeed adopting proper frameworks. So the GDPR is definitely a good model, but having just a good framework is not the end of it, right? You still need to be able to actually enforce your rights, which kind of relates to bigger questions of access to justice, etc. And even though the GDPR gives really great tools to an individual to do that, that doesn't mean that there's a level playing field for everyone to actually, you know, try and protect their own data rights. But it is a good start. but there's also a complementary question about like making sure that enforcement is meaningful, so that states actually enable data protection authorities to act, with with actual force when they engage in investigations, and also just generally kind of like who gets access to the justice system. But like with these concentrations of power, also like there's also other frameworks that we need to look at, right? Antitrust, or as we kind of like refer to the competition law framework, is really important in that regard as well. And what is really interesting is that in Europe at the moment, there's a conversation ongoing, kind of like making those systems more accessible as well for individuals and organizations through things like the Digital Service Act, etc., where you can actually enforce your rights rather than having to go through institutions, a commission that needs to kind of like sit on like really elaborate reports, which are really complicated to put together, really expensive, all of those things, and really kind of like make a framework that actually works a lot better for individuals with fewer resources to act.
Absolutely. I want to, we're running out of time here, Nani. You know, as we said last time, we could spend 3 hours, 30 hours, 300 hours talking about these topics. I just wanted to ask if it's okay if we bring in a listener question or a
Sure.
somebody who's watching this with us. So I want to tie this into one of our final topics as well, which is last week, Intel came under fire in Kotaku for announcing this service known as Bleep, that allows you to fine-tune settings that let you, kind of mute hate speech like racist and misogynist slurs and queerphobic and ableist language. And I think this really highlights the kind of challenges of balancing that notion of freedom of expression with the ability for people to be online without harassment or without violence. There's a question that I wanted to pose here that came in who's from somebody remaining anonymous, which is, given this context as well, what do we do about the issue of hate-based online groups twisting digital rights into a means of furthering colonization, freedom of expression, and privacy, for example, being used to protect groups that are far-right or that have fascist tendencies?
So what do we do? There's not like one answer to that question, but it very much relates to the wrong debate that we're having about speech regulation at the moment. And that is one that is not really focused on making sure that everyone actually has the possibility to participate in this online public debate that we're having. And having, facilitating groups and individuals that engage in hate speech, in bullying, harassment, etc., basically to silence certain voices online, should not be given that possibility. And I know that there's slightly differing views between the First Amendment kind of concept of freedom of expression and the rest of the world, if I can put it that way. But still, I think that overall, if the idea is that we want to have a vibrant public square in which we can debate matters of public interest, which all should support our democracy, we need to make sure that that's a safe space for everyone to engage in conversations and engage in robust conversations, right? I'm not saying that, everyone has to be nice to each other all the time online, but there do have to be consequences for behavior that basically silences others online. So the shielding of organizations that engage in hate speech, individuals that engage in bullying and harassment, in my view, is just as much an assault to freedom of expression as anything else.
Now, I know that you've written a lot about this before. I've read some of your articles about this tension between freedom of expression and, the ability to not limit, some of these organizations, but also to really confront the fact that there is so much of this hate speech ongoing and so much of this happening. I think a lot of the people who are watching today would be very interested to read some of your thoughts, read some of your content, read some of your work on this very complex and very nuanced subject area. So how can everyone here at DrupalCon North America stay up to date with your work, the work of the Digital Freedom Fund, and where can we find you online to follow along with all the amazing stuff you're doing?
That's very nice of you to ask. So most of my writings and talks and so on can be found on my personal website, which is nannyjansen.org. I'm on Twitter as @interwebs with a Z, Nanny. And the Digital Freedom Fund is digitalfreedomfund.org, and on Twitter @dffund, so @df_fund. But you know, any search engine will probably get you there. Yeah, and I guess we're also on some other terrible corporate platforms, but fine.
And I'm sure we'll be able to talk much more offline about that, Nani, for sure. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us on this fireside chat here at DrupalCon North America 2021. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today for us to have this chat. Hope that everyone enjoyed this session, and I wish everyone a wonderful rest of your DrupalCon.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure.